Hi everyone, we're back again, and in this next session we want to dive deeper into the topic of implementing the EU taxonomy and whether it's more standardization or fragmentation when it comes to market approaches. And I'm thrilled to be moderating the next session here, and I'm joined by a very excelling panel. With this, I'd also like to bring in our first speaker for this morning. That's Julie Emmrich from the World Green Building Council. She is a sustainable finance lead, and she also represents the building sector in EU's Sustainable Finance Platform, which is the European Commission's advisory body for sustainable finance policies. And I'm excited to have you here, Julie, and the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Seema. I'm very happy to be here. Hello, everyone. Yes, it's indeed a very accurate, or how to say, trendy topic again, the taxonomy, at least in my bubble. I'm happy to share some information with you. Should I go straight into the presentation, Seema?
Yes, sure.
Okay,
yeah.
Then let me share my screen. All right, so I'm with you for the next 15 minutes to talk about sustainable finance taxonomies, but also outside of Europe. So let me dive straight into it. At the World Green Building Council, and of course, DGNB is one of them, valued members, but we represent more than 85 countries in the World Green Building Council network, as you can see on the screen. And collectively, our network represents more than 50,000 companies. So we're spread out on all the continents. So what do we do as a collective network? We train, we do advocacy. We've led to policy changes in our sector in 30 countries in the last year. As many of you know, a lot of our members also run green building certification tools. We do awareness raising, etc. So you can see on the screen some of the kind of numbers we collect from the network. So with that insight, I'm happy to talk a bit more on sustainable finance. There's three overarching goals that we pursue as a collective network, which is the total decarbonization of the built environment, healthy, equitable, resilient building cities and communities, regenerative natural systems, and a thriving circular economy. So how do we get there? That's where my role comes in, because we see the transformation to a sustainable built environment as a systemic one. So you can see the three goals on the slides, and then we also bring in our strategy and activities sustainable finance and ESG. So our vision specifically then on sustainable finance, or through sustainable finance, are buildings that are future-proofed and managed by entities disclosing and addressing financial risks from climate change, investing in the appropriate and impactful actions, and safeguarding value and economic stability. Then I'm not going to go in the details of all the activities we do as a network. It's a bit much. The only thing I wanted to highlight on this slide is that we do have, as part of our strategy and activities, a whole section dedicated to the finance sector, and specifically to equip finance actors to deploy impactful capital. And of course, the sustainable finance taxonomies bring in a sort of guide to help actors deploy their capital effectively towards the environmental objectives that the government set out to achieve and translate through the sustainable finance taxonomies. So this is why, as a network, we are very embedded in the topic of sustainable finance taxonomies. And of course, we know that finance flows are global and international. They know no borders. So there is a need for comparability. But at the same time, especially in the built environment, the challenges, but also sustainability solutions are very localized and contextualized. So this is a challenge we face when working on sustainable finance taxonomies. So it's not just the EU taxonomy that exists out there. It was the first one published in 2021. But this is already actually an outdated map you see on the screen. They're really proliferating sustainable finance taxonomies at the international level. And even now, a lot of governments and experts are writing new sustainable finance taxonomies, but also updating the ones that exist. Like, for example, the ASEAN taxonomy, which is kind of the other regional taxonomy, but the European one for Asia Pacific has been updated 3 times already. So it is a very busy landscape, so to say. And I would say maybe as a final note on the global state of sustainable finance taxonomies, that it's really in Latin America and Asia Pacific that they seem to be proliferating the most. So how does it relate to back to our network? What you can see on the slide here is the number of our members, the National Agreement Council, such as DGNB, that report their activities on the topic of sustainable finance. And you can see that especially so in the Americas, Europe, but also Africa, and Asia Pacific, a lot of our members report being involved in the development of sustainable finance taxonomy, so inputting to the criteria as experts, as either leading the work or being experts that review the development of sustainable finance taxonomies. And then, of course, there is also the link to the green building certification schemes and rating tools that are operated in the network. So there's a lot of work on alignment of these towards the taxonomies, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this specifically from the DGNB later in this session. And then there is a whole range of services being provided by our members at the global level for taxonomy compliance and implementation, and a lot of kind of training and awareness raising and help, sometimes directly targeting banks for the kind of implementation of these taxonomies. So moving on. We have done a lot of work specifically on the EU taxonomy as a network since 2023 mainly. So you can find all of these resources on our website if you just go to World GBC Sustainable Finance. They're all uploaded there. Some of them we have done in partnership, for example, with EPRA, the ones you can see on the slides, on the implementation of the EU taxonomy. But we've also looked at the do no significant harm criteria that often pose certain challenges. We also had a position paper on integrating life cycle global warming potential criteria into the EU taxonomy, looking at circular economy and also specifically EU taxonomy verification and assurance that I will come back to in a moment. And then, as Seema mentioned, World GBC has been part of the EU platform on sustainable finance for the last years. And it's currently the 3rd mandate. The mandate always runs for 2 years. And so we're back on the platform for a 3rd mandate. Originally, the World GBC at the European level was involved on the Green Mortgage Initiative. That's many years ago. And that led us to get into the EU platform on sustainable finance to help develop the taxonomy criteria. A big disclaimer here, of course, is that the EU platform on sustainable finance provides recommendations and advises the European Commission, but it is the policymakers, so the regulators that then write the legal text. So we can't be held accountable for what's written in the Climate Delegated Act or Environmental Delegated Act. But in the last mandate, which ran 2023 to 2024, there was a very long report put out that you can see on the screen, Advancing Sustainable Finance. And that was the first time that the Platform on Sustainable Finance looked at the review of the existing criteria. Until now, the work had always focused on the development of new criteria. That was the first effort to review existing criteria and how they're being used in the by industry and finance. And I'd like to because it's a very long report of more than 300 pages. If you want to look at the recommendations on construction and real estate, it's page 107 to 121. 121. And then we also did some work on new criteria. So the review of the EU taxonomy through the platform was based on the stakeholder request mechanism that maybe not enough people know about, but it's the official tool of the Commission to get feedback from the markets on the need for new, like developing criteria for new economic activities, but also getting feedback on existing criteria in the EU taxonomy. And this is looked at on a regular basis by the Commission and also the Platform on Sustainable Finance. So if you have any burning feedback on the EU taxonomy, I would definitely encourage you to use the stakeholder request mechanism. That is the official channel to do so. Then the platform has done a lot of work on the EU taxonomy for the last years, and there was a whole report mainly driven by the finance sector on data and usability of EU taxonomy reporting. So we used that as a basis to come up with recommendations on updating the EU taxonomy. There was also the reported compendium of market practices, reviewing market practices essentially. That was also very informative for the work we did. And I'm skipping over some, but there was quite some stakeholder engagement with expert roundtables, a consultation period of the recommendations we made that a lot of industry associations commented on and we took on board. And then, of course, the Platform on Sustainable Finance itself hosts around 100 people that are experts on sustainable finance. So a lot of debates and discussions also took place in that group. So I just want to pick a bit on the type of things that are in there, but of course it's very extensive, so I can't go into any details. But the key barriers we really see in our sector, and I would argue it's still the case nowadays, is a lack of consistent and comparable data. And therefore also the heterogeneity of different asset types. And of course, there is a really well-established landscape of green instruments like green mortgages or, of course, green building certification schemes that the EU taxonomy should be integrated into and not, duplicative of or, proposing a new standard that's not aligned. And then renovation is still kind of ill addressed in the EU taxonomy, as we see also in when monitoring climate finance or EU taxonomy aligned finance, that a lot goes to individual measures in buildings and new construction, but very much less so in renovation of buildings, which is where the priority should be on, as this is the kind of most urgent need for finance. Again, here I'm not going to go into too much detail because it would take some time, but I just wanted to highlight that as part of the work we did on looking at the need to update the EU taxonomy, we found out that it wasn't just the criteria themselves and the ambition level that needed to be updated, but there are some proper structural issues in the way the EU taxonomy is written for our sector in construction and real estate that has inconsistencies. So I'm just going to give one or two examples from the slide, but for example, if you renovate a building and comply with the criteria for the renovation of a building, it doesn't necessarily lead to a building that has then EPC A performance, but then for the acquisition and ownership of buildings, so the investors and owners of buildings, the requirement there is EPC-A. So it means a EU taxonomy aligned renovated building could not necessarily be acquired in compliance with the EU taxonomy. I hope that makes sense. So there are some of these structural issues we found that we said need prioritization to address. And I hope this will be picked up. But let me come to my next slides. And then we also made some recommendation on construction, renovation, acquisition, and ownership beyond the structural issues what needed to happen. So, for example, of course, this is outdated and didn't happen, but the disclosure of life cycle global warming potential via energy performance certificates, replacing the EU taxonomy still refers to the old EPBD, so there's a need to refer to the new EPBD being the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. So replacing, for example, terminology such as major renovation to deep renovation, replacing terminology such as nearly zero energy buildings to zero emissions buildings, all these things. And I hope this is being addressed by the Commission, of course, but that's the long list of recommendations we came up with 2 years ago. And just to say, of course, a lot of you probably heard of the omnibus. I just wanted to mention that the EU Platform on Sustainable Finance has been working on simplification and usability of the EU taxonomy for many years. And here to report on the screen that came out in 2025 on usability and data challenges with EU taxonomy reporting, and specifically also report on helping SMEs to report EU taxonomy compliance. And we, of course, hope that all the work done in this report is also being picked up by the regulators. Now I come to the Platform on Sustainable Finance third mandate. It just started in February. And World GBC, on the picture, you can see those that attended the kind of kickoff meeting in February in Brussels. And World GBC will be the sector lead for construction and real estate. And as usual, the mandate from the European Commission, that also on the picture, is to the Platform on Sustainable Finance is to review the existing technical screening criteria, and the Commission is about to release an updated Climate and Environmental Delegated Act. So they have simplified and updated the criteria, and of course we hope the recommendations have been taken on. So that will come out very soon for a public consultation that everyone can take part in. But then, of course, the Platform on Sustainable Finance also was mandated to develop new criteria and still looking at the usability and simplification of not only the EU taxonomy this time, but the wider sustainable finance framework. So how does EU taxonomy align with CSRD, SFDR, the Green Bond standard, etc. And very new in a way, because this had been parked in the last mandate, is the focus to work on transition finance. Exactly. And then a subgroup from the platform also monitors capital flows. So I think I'm running out of time. So I will maybe actually skip a few of these slides, but what I wanted to highlight is just that the EU is actually the only jurisdiction that has in place a governance scheme with mandatory disclosures. The taxonomies everywhere else are voluntary to disclose, and yeah, so that's a big difference. And yeah, there is a very complex, in a way, in the EU, very complex sustainable finance policy package that goes beyond the EU taxonomy, but is referred to the EU taxonomy. So, of course, this is currently top of the agenda for the Commission to address and, better integrate these different policies in a harmonized way. Yeah, and I just want to say that we also see that there is a gap between the legal text in place and EU taxonomy reporting in practice, with a lot of challenges in the market. So we have, as a network, proposed a EU taxonomy verification and assurance framework, and are still, talking to the Commission and different organizations how to kind of guide the EU taxonomy reporting in our sector. But I'm sure the next presentations will touch upon that. So I will stop at this stage and thank you for your time and the opportunity to present.
Thanks so much for the insight also in the global implementation of taxonomies. I found it very interesting to see that the EU was the first country to, EU was the first area first to implement or introduce a taxonomy, and that the ASEAN probably came sometime after, but already has updated their version of the taxonomy 3 times, which is quite impressive if we think about how we are still struggling to bring harmonization between the implementation across different European member states. But I think Sebastian will also touch upon that in his small presentation. Sebastian, you are an energy and sustainability expert at ATP Sustain GmbH, and you've got already a lot of insight because you've been applying the taxonomy both in Austria and in Germany, and I'm happy to hear the insights you're going to share on what your experience has been to applying it in different countries. The stage is yours.
Exactly. Thank you very much. So I will share my slides as well. Just a quick second. So yes, exactly. Thank you very much for having us. We were thinking to give you a brief introduction in the differences of the documentation processes when it comes to the EU taxonomy compliance process. So I guess by now the EU taxonomy is part of our daily to-do list, and even though there are already many similarities in Europe and also the EU taxonomy providing more uniform requirements, let's not forget there's still, as the map also shows, quite many countries. So all member states, they have their own country-specific requirements and habits. I guess the best example is actually Austria and Germany. I mean, it's 2 countries having similar climate, similar culture, similar traditions, a similar language in most parts at least, and yet they're very different. And it's the same for all the other EU member states. So I guess the question is fair to ask that how does the EU taxonomy review process work in other countries? What we've experienced is that most EU countries already have a global Green Building Council, as we've seen before now, and they usually provide very good guidelines and harmonize or aim to harmonize these processes. But then there are other countries like Slovakia, for example, which do not have a GBC. And then investors are usually also required to pursue taxonomy compliance within these countries. So they struggle much more than others. So we've experienced an increasing request for projects from these countries, and they usually try to align their criteria to the DGNB or ÖGNI standards, since those systems are usually held in quite high regards. It works quite well, so most criteria can be aligned to other standards, but then on the other hand, there are some local requirements that usually lead to major differences. Another example would be Switzerland, for example. Switzerland has a very familiar GBC, but then Switzerland is not part of the EU, so has no standards at all. Basically, I mean, they have standards, but it's not compulsory to pursue them in order to get some EU taxonomy compliance. But then still, Switzerland is a very attractive country for investors. So we wanted to give you a brief introduction, since we work, as Seema introduced, we work across borders. We have an office in Munich and Vienna. We work quite closely together and work with cross-border projects, and have experienced some of the differences with these projects. I want to share the similarities and the difficulties we've encountered with. So I would like to start with the positive side, to show the criteria that work well, criteria that work similar. It's not my intention now to dive into the specifics of the submission documentation, That would go a bit too far, I guess, for this presentation for today. And also the tools and templates that are provided are usually worked or developed in cooperation, and therefore usually provide quite good similar broad basis. So I guess what we can say in general is that there are overall 4 factors that usually help to ensure that the interpretation and verification in the process and the project qualities work equally. So there are 4 factors that play a role. The first one would be if there are standards that are implemented uniformly within the EU. So it's the typical EN standards we know. For example, when it comes to the building site investigation, it's usually an evidence that's required anyway. Usually an evidence that has a certain process, works within all countries. Same counts for the measurements of the building envelope integrity, which we need for buildings above 5,000 square meters. Another factor would be when the documentation is based on or can be aligned to a certification system like the DGNB. I'm talking about the life cycle assessment, for example. When we can align those criteria to the level system or the DGNB system, it usually works quite smoothly. Same accounts for the circular construction qualities. So I'm talking in reference to the TEC 1.6 criteria set, for example. Or the best way is usually when the taxonomy or the specifications are defined within the regulation itself. So we know it. I think the best example would be the flow rate values for the sanitary appliances. So we have fixed values within the regulations, so nobody asks questions how it actually could be interpreted in other countries. Same accounts for the values, maximum values of low emitting materials, or the very good example as well is the execution and interpretation of climate risk analysis. So these are, for example, criteria that work very well across borders. And the last factor would be if it's we call this soft criteria. What could be understood under soft criteria? Soft criteria can be, for example, the energy monitoring system. The regulation leaves enough room for interpretation by still giving quite good direction forward. Or, for example, also the construction site concepts. So these are examples from the EU taxonomy, from the environmental objectives that usually work well. We haven't experienced much differences with those. But then in contrast, there are, of course, some factors that play a role that lead to less similar approaches and give us like key pain points. So obstacles usually arise when criteria is influenced by national interpretations. And I guess the best known example we've talked about before now as well, or we've heard before now, is the definition and regulation regarding the nearly zero energy buildings and falling short of the threshold values for the primary energy demand. This is actually quite critical criteria, since the Annex 1 is still the preferred way to demonstrate compliance in the whole of Europe. Doesn't matter if it's Germany or Austria. So what we've heard from other partners, companies, clients, they usually pursue Annex 1, and it's quite different in all of the countries. So country-specific interpretation in the calculation methodology, in the display of the EPCs, they make the comparability and a uniform requirements very difficult. That does not only count for the new construction, but like we've heard before, also for the existing building for acquisition and ownership. Like in Germany, for example, there is no classes for non-residential buildings, at least on the EPC. In Austria, we have a class, but then the class for the primary energy demand includes the renewable part as well, and thus deviates from the national benchmarks definitions. So as you can see, it's not aligned with national standards. It's not aligned across borders, which leads to very big differences as well. Other topics, for example, are when it comes, it's a major topic when it comes to the assessment of the valuable biodiversity areas and the screening of water resources worthy of protection. Some countries do include the investigation in prior rezoning processes. Other countries do it less so. Austria, for example. So the result is that there is a very significant deviation in the depth of verification required for the verification process than when we apply for the verification part. So the difficulty in these criteria then lied to identifying and evaluating the pre-existing processes that determine whether additional checks are needed and required to verify the compliance within these countries. So there are positive criteria. There are more criteria with more obstacles, and I think it's fair to ask why it is important to harmonize these processes. If we look at our clients, at the companies that are pursuing the compliances, we're usually talking about big holding companies, investors, international investors, banks, insurance companies. So very large companies that usually also operate across many borders. So it's crucial for them to have identical requirements, especially when it comes to the annual reporting. It's the worst case for them to have like one document for the one country and a total different one for the other country when they're trying to verify the exact same objectives. So above all, I guess it's important to try to avoid the differences, try to avoid ambiguities, and to ensure the comparability and transparency. So after all, that's the main goal of the EU taxonomy.
Sebastian, could you just share maybe the next slide again, because it seems to be stuck in the.
Which one do you see?
Maybe just go back and forth. And now again to the slide. Yeah, perfect. Now we can see it clearly. Thank you.
Yeah, it's the call for close collaboration.
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah.
Good, thank you. Yeah, so as I was saying, it would be also a very important part for GBCs, since a close or to work on consistent requirements also reduces the risks for the GBCs when they're issuing the verification certificates. And then, of course, also for us auditors, it helps in the project management when we're working exactly on these projects across borders. So it was the idea to give a brief insight on the positive and the positive sides and the hurdles. I would like to end the presentation, therefore, with a call for more closer collaboration and a call to ensure consistency and more comparability and transparency for us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. I really liked your insights you gave, and also highlighting the difficulties and challenges, basically. Now I'd like to, I'll be joined by Ursula Hartenberger, Secretary General of the Climate Positive Europe Alliance, short for CPEA. Ursula has a long-term experience in the area of sustainability and buildings, and you were also at the heart of things when the EU taxonomy first started, which is now nearly 10 years ago, I believe. And we'll be talking a little bit about the climate positive taxonomy partnership we're about to launch, but maybe just to get started, maybe you can just briefly highlight what is CPEA and why was it developed?
Yeah, thank you, Seema. Yes, I was very much at the heart of it because I was overseeing the development of the technical screening criteria in the first incarnation of the taxonomy report for buildings. So as far as CPEA is concerned, which is short for Climate Positive Europe Alliance, we were founded in 2021. And the founding members at the time, they were Bergne, the Austrian Green Building Council, the Spanish Green Building Council, the DGNB. And since we've grown from, we've gone from strength to strength, we have now a number of green building councils, Switzerland, Croatia, Denmark, but also Belgium now, and France. And we're very happy that we can also count the Architects Council of Europe as one of our members. And so why was CPEA founded? It was very much around the thinking that we need to have almost like a bridging mechanism between policy and practice, because we feel that often, that when policy is being developed here at Brussels level, there is, there's a bit of a lack of an insight on what these things actually mean when they're getting implemented within the market. So it was really, the aim is really to inform policymaking, but equally taking the policy that has been developed and actually spell out to the market, what does that actually mean? What does that mean for CPEA's members? So this is very much kind of like an information interchange, as you can imagine. It's also about knowledge sharing, of course, because we already heard that there are cultural differences in how these things are being tackled, how policies are being implemented. And it's good to discuss with one's peers from across Europe. And I think that's one of the major benefits of CPEA. And also to find, common solutions and to ensure that there's greater alignment. And that, of course, brings me directly to the taxonomy, because, one of the first things that we did as CPEA was to do a reality check in the form of some market participant studies, whereby we investigated how easy was it to implement the taxonomy, to get the data, and to fulfill the requirements with market participants across Europe. So that was our first joint project, and that was basically, how the focus of our work on sustainable finance, which is now really being driven forward by Seema, which I'm very grateful for, has come about. So one of the major issues that we found was obviously the data availability and the lack of harmonization, the lack of alignment. And one thing that particularly stood out is, how do you actually verify taxonomy alignments? Because the Commission provided the framework, but it didn't really provide that many tools how to prove that you were in alignment with the taxonomy. It did not provide any kind of data collection tool either, and it left it really much to the market. So this is how some green building councils within the CPEA membership thought, well, we need to respond to market demand and develop some kind of mechanism of verification. So, one of the pioneers we heard from, you heard maybe from Petra beforehand, from the Austrian Green Building Council. They pioneered this. The DGNB does this now. We have also Spain has now actually recognized the Spanish Green Building Council as the only body in Spain that can carry out taxonomy verification. So that's a really big success. And we really want to overcome the fragmentation that exists among countries, because I think we've heard it before. There's a lot of cross-border investment and it doesn't stop at the border. So we need to be able to have some comparability and also learn from each other. So this is why we are now setting up the taxonomy, the CPEA EU taxonomy partnership, which is a new kind of additional member category for our existing members. And we want to formalize this offering that already exists in some of the member organizations to bring that under the umbrella of the Climate Positive Europe Alliance and offer a kind of Europe-wide service whereby, the the right to actually carry out verifications is very much remains at the national level with the national GBCs. And the idea, again, is very much around knowledge sharing, creating a unified methodology, and thereby creating consistent approaches. And this is really open to all our members, all our GBC members who are CPEA members. So I think this is pretty much the verification scheme in a nutshell, but maybe a little bit about the benefits as well. So the keywords are very much standardization, and we are providing guidelines on how to achieve that. Brand recognition, you already saw a logo on Sebastian's presentation. So this is the logo that is being licensed to participating GBCs. And big word is collaboration and transparency. And ultimately, what we're hoping to achieve through the taxonomy partnership has also wider implications, is that we are increasing data availability within the sector, and that we also, by doing that and by providing insights and feedback, can also, again, inform policymaking and help the sustainable finance platform, for instance, to have like real market data and real market feedback. So this is really what we're striving to do.
Ursula, I think collaboration here is the key, basically, because what we learned in Julie's presentation, the EU taxonomy is actually one which is mandatory to report to. I mean, you could be non-taxonomy compliant, but that the fact that it is mandatory also means that you need to know how to implement the EU taxonomy across the board. And I'd be curious, Sebastian, if you could just join in the discussion now to hear from you, how much freedom do you think is really necessary and how much like guidance is actually needed? Because sometimes we find that policy feedback is, oh, it's too detailed. And then other times it's like, oh, no, it's not detailed enough. And how can we, like, we as GBCs or also as CPEA, we see our role in helping along and giving out implementation guideline, but how much is really necessary and how much would be too much at the end as well?
I guess when it comes to the EU taxonomy, the more guidelines there are, the better. What we've experienced is that many clients, they fear the taxonomy a bit. So the issue with the taxonomy is that if you can't comply with one criteria, you're out. So you're not complying with the whole EU taxonomy. In contrast to the certification system, if you lose points, you always have a bit of freedom to pursue other points in order to achieve your objectives. So that gives many uncertainties for many clients, and they actually try to have more certainty within the taxonomy area in order to be sure for that. So I guess it's advisable to have more guidelines in terms of the EU taxonomy.
Okay, and maybe Julie, if you could come in on this topic as well, because I'm curious to see, is it only across Europe? I mean, you mentioned that there is the Asian taxonomy, which is optional, as I understood, but then there must be also some interpretation leeway for Asian countries to implement the Asian taxonomy. Do you know how other countries are dealing with this topic of too much standardization or like harmonizing or comparability?
Yes, I think it's a very, very big topic, alignment and interoperability of taxonomies. I don't think the solution has really been found yet, especially not in our sector that's, as I mentioned before, like very heterogeneous, very contextualized. It's so much more difficult, rating sustainability than in the energy sector, for example, which is more straightforward to do. So And then to come back on your question on the ASEAN taxonomy, the ASEAN taxonomy I think is interesting because it builds onto existing national taxonomies that exist. So it's different than in Europe, right? In Europe, we have just the one. What we see in Asia is that there are national taxonomies, and then the ASEAN one is to help with alignment specifically. And it doesn't go into the detail, like it doesn't have the level of detail on criteria. It's more process oriented, so principles based, to ensure that the process to report sustainable finance is kind of strong enough in a way. So it's a different approach for sure. And I think one thing to mention is that we're currently as a network analyzing the different taxonomies and the approach to our sector. So I will have more to say about that in a few weeks' time when we're done with the analysis. And then we're also working out principles to align taxonomies at the international level. And I think what's very interesting to say on this is that from the, let's say, preliminary results of the analysis, most of the taxonomies refer to green building certification as a means to comply. Sometimes also the thresholds, but then I think you have a bit the same difficulty, as Sebastian mentioned, with, as we have in Europe, where directive then refers to different standards and they're maybe not aligned in the methodology. So it's a bit what you have if you look at the ASEAN taxonomy, and it says there's a list of green building rating tools you can comply with. But then as an investor, you have to go look for the actual criteria somewhere. So that's one thing to say. And then maybe the last thing I'd say on the taxonomy alignment and harmonization is that what is interesting to see is that the EU taxonomy put a lot of thinking in a framework on how to define sustainability, and that is largely being taken up. So, the thing that there is one or more environmental objectives to choose from to do a significant contribution. So you focus, but then there is, depends from taxonomy to taxonomy, but 4 to 6 environmental objectives you still have to comply with. And also minimum social safeguards is a concept that is being replicated. So in general, there is quite a similar approach to defining sustainable finance, and more so. So that is an interesting one, but definitely more work to be done on that front.
Thanks for your insight. I think it's interesting because it also means that it's a place where Europe, or the platform or the European Commission can learn as to, especially when it comes to further developing the EU taxonomy, and when it comes to countries like European investors also invest outside Europe. So, and then they also still have to report according to EU taxonomy, which makes it quite difficult to learn from that approach of just like referring to other taxonomies which are already valid in that specific country. Ursula, what do you see if we look at like down the road 5 years from now? How do you imagine, or could this taxonomy partnership, which we are trying to set up at Climate Positive Europe Alliance, how do you envision? How could that add on to that space?
Well, I think, as I said before, hopefully, we will improve the data availability issue, because even though there is data there, there's still some gaps, especially with regard to some of the 2 most significant harm criteria. And it's also not across the whole board of stakeholders. Some stakeholders, some market participants have more data in-house than others. So I'm hoping that will greatly improve, because that's one of my personal sort of missions, because it also increases the transparency across the whole sector and also the comparability of the sector. And I think that, no man, no woman is an island. I think the whole collaboration aspect is set to make a real difference. And obviously we're hoping And if I fast forward to 5 years, I'm kind of like hoping that we will have more partners in the membership as well, so that we can really truly say that this is representative of Europe and the EU taxonomy. So, and also what I'm hoping that this will create is less uncertainty and more clarity in the market by having a harmonized and aligned approach.
More clarity in the market. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ursula. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Sebastian.